to kind of share the screen with you, I tell you that next week we're gonna have Isabel. So, you know, she's gonna give us some hands-on kind of experience as far as something like translanguaging is concerned, although she might not be sure that she is translanguaging, as she said, but, you know, we will see what she's doing. Okay, and then we start to talk about the term paper. Okay, so because you're going to have to write a term paper, and we are in the middle of the semester, and I always like, if I have a class with a term paper, I always like students to be prepared for the term papers and start to work on that on time. So we're going to discuss that. And also, last time I raised the possibility of writing a group paper about translanguaging that reflects the opinion of some of the people, because I said that that's not compulsory at all. So, you know, if you want to participate, you participate. If it's not, you will not. So there were 3 students so far who said that they would like to kind of participate. So I think that if you participate, the term paper could include the issues that you want to discuss in the group paper, because, you know, this group paper should be something like an essay that reflects different opinions, as we basically discussed that in this class. So that is one of the things. Another thing is that we have to, we might be able to kind of develop a common line of thinking based on what we have been discussing here, and that will be also fine. But I will see how many people will join us, and then I'll have a meeting with those people and we discuss actually what we can do. Okay, so if you are still interested, you can notify me in town about that. Otherwise, as I want to emphasize, it's not compulsory at all. So, but if you participate, you can develop your own ideas further in your term paper. So these are overlapping projects somehow, but of course, you since that's the group paper is something that will be produced not by one person. Of course, you cannot use the whole thing as a term paper as well, but you can use your ideas and the discussion lines and everything, you know, the arguments that you make in your term paper as well. Okay. Do you have any questions? If not, then let's try to share the screen. Okay. Yeah. I was almost sure that I will not see my slides, in spite of the fact that I deliberately opened them before I started this whole thing, you know, so I don't know where they are. Let me try again. Here it is. Okay. Let's go back. It's there. I don't know why, but it's there now, so no problem. Can you see the slides?
Yes, Professor.
You can see, all right, so there is no problem with that after all. I still haven't been able to figure out why this happens, and it happens not only with this Zoom. Actually, this Thursday, I'm going to give a keynote at a conference in China, and they use some kind of wooing, or Han knows that what's the name of that, Google. I was worried that I won't be able to use that properly because I've never used that before, but hopefully it will work all right. So these technical things are still problematic. Okay, so let's start. You know, the second part of the book, the part of the book that we are reading right now is about translanguaging in education. So in the first part, we talked mainly about theoretical things. And we have had very good discussions on the theoretical issues. And now we have to relate all this to education. we have to relate that to practicum. And this is what the book tries to do. Of course, there are some issues there that I want to raise briefly in class. So let's start with what they say about this classroom issue. So they say that translanguaging in classrooms is an approach to bilingualism that is centered not on the acquisition and development of languages, as has often been the case, but on the practices of bilingual students and the teachers that are readily observable and that are different from our traditional conceptions of autonomous languages. Translanguaging is an approach that can be followed in all classrooms, whether monolingual or bilingual, and by all teachers, whether monolingual or bilingual, for equitable learning. Okay, so what does this really mean? First of all, do you think that translanguaging can be used in any kind of classroom? Do you agree with that statement? Well, of course, there are bilingual or multilingual people, because they emphasize also that even in monolingual classrooms, but what we are interested mainly is how it is used in bilingual and multilingual classrooms.
You know, I always think about my own context of working in Japanese universities and observing, you know, the different ways that non-native Japanese users, English teachers, would use Japanese to work with the students was very different than the way that the native Japanese English teachers would use Japanese to speak with the students.
Mm-hmm. And what was the difference?
I think that one of them still viewed things from a very configurational perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one was really focused on relaying more than just the meaning of it, more than just the label to label.
Mm-hmm. So they followed mainly the label in one of the types, and in the other type, they went beyond that.
I think so. I think that's how I would describe the difference.
Yeah, and in the second slide, there is something about that too, because, you know, what they call flexible languaging in teaching, this is something like that, because the common assumption is that in a language classroom, only the target language has to be used. Okay, that has been there for not only decades, but even more, you know, that we try to do our best to use as much target language as possible in the language classroom. Why was that? That was because we wanted to teach not only the code, but we wanted to teach what the code actually encodes, what the code actually encapsulates. And the only way to do that is to try to kind of bring into the classroom some kind of target language behavior, you know? So there was some reason why many people have tried to do this in the language classroom. However, right now, what they say, this is not really the case. So this is not what you have to do. You do not necessarily have to rely on the target language only when you teach a language. I think that we may have to make a difference between an actual language classroom where your goal is to teach the target language only and no content. Or because the second scenario is when you teach content through the target language. So these are two different things, in my opinion. I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but as far as language teaching is concerned, when you teach just the language itself, you may want to rely much less on the full repertoire of the students. This is what many teachers say. And focus mainly on the target language. It doesn't mean, of course, that you cannot rely on the first language of the students or some other languages that they know. It's not about that, but the main focus should be on the target language. As far as content area is concerned, it's another thing, because usually the main issue is the content. And it doesn't matter what kind of language repertoire you have, you want to kind of alert that full language repertoire in order for you to make sense of the text that you use in the classroom or create meaning. So these are two different scenarios. I don't know whether you agree with me, but I think that definitely we may want to kind of make a difference between the two. Okay, what do you think? So let's take first the scenario when you teach the target language. So your goal in the classroom is you are in France and you want to teach English. So your class, the target is the English language. So the teacher teaches the English language to French students. Of course, you know, there is nothing like French students or French classroom anymore because there is no homogeneous classroom. So there are people there from all over the world, just like here in America, but to a lesser degree. But the target, the goal is to teach the language. What do we do? How much can we use translanguaging in the sense that we have discussed this here in the classroom, in our class?
I think you just made a really important point about how classes are not homogeneous, how there are such a variety of languages. And one of the biggest challenges, in my opinion, of bringing translanguaging into the classroom is when teachers don't have that shared experience as the speakers, or when they don't have peers of the same language, because at least in my education, they teach us, oh, use cognates, bring all these other elements of the language that you know into the classroom, but when you don't have that shared element, or you have multiple languages in the classroom, that's not always feasible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, other opinion?
Well, I just wanted to bring back some of the comments that some of the presenters in their teacher interviews gave us. And I think it was regarding the teaching of the language itself. And so I remember that, I'm not sure if it was Roberto that said that some of the teachers did not use the first language. I'm sorry, they did use the first language when they were bringing aspects of either directions or culture or for low proficiency students. So I think that's still in the foreign language classroom, there are moments that maybe the first language needs to be brought in if you want complete understanding of some of these things. So just that.
Okay.
If I could add, I think that was my interviewee. Yes, Isabel, you're right. And I think that it seems that I agree with you. I completely agree. And it would seem to me that you're sort of like framing the use of translanguaging with the goal of achieving the target language, which I think would distinguish that scenario from another scenario where the content is more important and the language is not like the objective in itself. So the framing of translanguaging in that scenario is a little bit different.
Yeah.
So the way that you deal with translanguaging and the way you bring it in is different because of your goal, like your guiding principle of how you organize the learning goal, I think, in that situation. But then there's I'm not sure if I want to change the subject, because I think I'll let other people speak, Professor, but I want to, because we started off by asking, like, is this, that was in the slide, right? Is this valid in all types of situations or contexts?
Yeah.
And I want to touch on something which is a little bit different than what we're talking about, but I can wait and do that later.
Okay. There is just one thing I want to mention, because it's a kind of interesting thing in practice, how people actually approach this issue. Because Isabel knows that I've taught in Barcelona several times at all these universities, University of Barcelona, Autonomous, Complutense, and so on. And when I was there, I met some American students. Actually, some of them took my classes, and there were two girls who taught in a school, in a private school, that hired them because they didn't speak Spanish. So they especially looked for people, the teachers, Americans or British, who do not speak a single word in Spanish, because what they were afraid of was that they use Spanish in the classroom. So they wanted teachers who speak only English. So that was the main goal. They said, okay, I mean, we really need it, because I was very much interested in that, and I went to the school, to tell the truth, and I talked to the vice principal there, and she said that, well, we really want people. We have teachers who speak Spanish, so it is not that they do not use any bilingual people, but they specifically hired Americans or British who do not speak Spanish. So that was in their advertisement. Okay, come to teach Spanish, but you are hired if you don't speak Spanish. That was funny, but that's a particular approach to this issue. That in certain cases, the native speaker teacher is someone who is on high demand. And that excludes, of course, translanguaging. However, I tell you that even in those cases, when the teacher doesn't speak a single word in the language of the students, you still can rely to some extent on the first language of the students, because you can give them tasks when you say that, okay, just think about how it is, this is in your first language, and report back to me or tell me in English what it is. So even then, there is a possibility to use the first language of the student to do some kind of translanguaging. Okay. And let me ask you about one thing before I give the chance to Roberto to go back to what he wanted to raise. Here is this issue, because when we talk about language, we said that basically there are these sides, the two sides, the sociocultural background knowledge that is absolutely needed to make sense of the science. Linguistic science. But what happens in the foreign language or second language classroom, where you have to teach the target language, if you say that, okay, that's not important? So there is an issue here, a very important issue for the translanguaging, actually, because all right, there is nobody here, who would say that translanguaging is not important, but the degree, because you cannot say that, all right, I focus only on the code. You cannot focus on the code. You should focus also on the sociocultural background of the target language in order for the students to have some kind of idea why exactly those signs mean what they mean. Okay, so here is how that will take away some time from translanguaging. Or does it really take away time from translanguaging? Are there any ways where actually understanding the target language sociocultural background can be supported somehow by comparison to the first language or other languages or things like this? So that is even not that simple. What do you think about that? Because in the second slide, my question is that how about this flexible language teaching, this language use? Because it doesn't it mean that we go back to the grammar's translation method, code switching, and what will happen? Of course, the sociocultural background knowledge of the target language. So these are legitimate issues that we have to answer when we talk about how to use translanguaging in the foreign language classroom or second language classroom. What do you think about this?
I think that's a really interesting question, because we do have to consider the degree to which it can be impactful to the students, considering the range of students and age levels and backgrounds and, you know, specific class types. So thinking between English as a second language students versus English as a foreign language students, and adult students, and, you know, child students, young learners. There's such a range of, there's such a range there that needs to be approached holistically, I think, because to what extent, to what degree can we let that student languaging happen? And then to what extent do we have to make sure that we're doing our job of giving these kids this other set of tools that they can then incorporate into this whole language repertoire that they then.
Yeah, you know, we have here students coming from countries like Vietnam, China, Sri Lanka, and in those countries, I don't think that translanguaging is that much appreciated. My guess is that the focus is on the target language. So, you know, when you teach English, you have to teach English and to try to speak as much English as possible. So that's the major goal. And of course, the good thing is that people who are educated somehow in the United States, I'm sure that they hear something about this translanguaging, and I'm sure that they will try to kind of incorporate that somehow in their practical work, you know, when they return to their home country. But I want to hear their opinion about that. So what do you think? Like Ngoc Tung, Vietnam, what do you say? How much translanguaging is possible there in the English classroom?
Well, I think it's not a popular practice in Vietnam, but the case should be in the fact that the native speakers of English will be the instructor in that class, and they kind of exercise that practice with their teaching assistants, because it's really hard for them to speak like in different languages in a unique system with the learners. So I believe that it's not very popular. Yeah.
Okay.
We do kind of like grammar translation method.
Yes, Professor Elaine say the teaching assistant can speak Vietnamese to individual learners who have trouble understanding the concept, right, Tung?
I see. All right.
And that's like in my school district. Yeah, that's like in my school district. Talking about teacher assistants, we have paraprofessionals who work with the teachers, so that individual students that have one-to-one support, they kind of help them to get the language of instruction, because necessarily the teacher may not know how to get across to such students. Like me, I don't speak Spanish, but in my class I have a Spanish paraprofessional, so that during the course of lesson he helps to make sure the students are carried along. Yeah, it happens all the time.
Okay, thank you. Roberto, let's go back to you, and you can raise your question right now.
Sure. I remember this from, I attended that webinar that Han shared with us, like I'm not sure if anyone else was here at that webinar for the multilingual perspective on translanguaging with Mick Swan and company. I remember Stephen May saying that it was difficult for translanguaging to happen in his in New Zealand, because they were very concerned with the revitalization of language there, so the Maori languages. And he said it was very difficult if you allowed for translanguage, like English would just dominate. So for the importance of revitalizing languages and conferring prestige to them, you couldn't actually have both languages competing in the same space. So that in New Zealand, they would prefer to have, like, if they do teach, they do promote bilingual education, but they promote it separately. Like, you learn English and you learn the native languages of the Maori people in New Zealand separately.
Roberto, they pronounce it Maori.
Maori.
Maori, yes. They don't
Maori.
pronounce the R, but they say Maori, yeah.
Maori, that's good.
That's a good point. You know, I was in New Zealand a couple of times, and actually, there was, I mean, one of the major goals is to revitalize. They invest enormous amount of money, you cannot imagine how much, into Maori. And it perfectly makes sense not to kind of put English on that Maori, because otherwise, and it makes absolute sense, you know. So you want to use English only when it is absolutely necessary, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, you know, because the language is struggling. So, you know, to get it stronger and stronger, you know, you have to use that somehow. And there is something like this in Ireland as well. I don't know whether you have had any kind of reading or possibility to be there, but they want to revitalize Irish. When you are in Ireland, you know, you see all these Irish signs and everything, and people are encouraged to do that. And in the school, they study that, but nobody speaks Irish, you know. Everybody speaks English, you know. So that's a very strong effort. Again, you know, Ireland also invests quite a bit of money into teaching Irish in schools, you know. And of course, it's not working that well, but they are not giving it up, which makes sense absolutely, because that's their original native tongue. Okay. Yes, we still have some time, so let's go to this slide and see. They are relying in this part of the book, they rely on Williams. You remember Williams's use of translanguaging for the first time in Welsh, and they try to kind of summarize what actually Williams said about translanguaging, and this passage summarizes his ideas, and it says that the process of translanguaging uses various cognitive processing skills in listening and reading, the assimilation and accommodation of information, choosing and selecting from the base storage to communicating, speaking, and writing. Thus, translanguaging requires a deeper understanding than just translating. Yeah, because, you know, he was using translanguaging in relation to translating. And of course, in translating, you rely on two languages. So that looks like a translanguaging practice, which it is. But Williams emphasizes that it is deeper. It goes deeper because it moves from finding parallel words to processing and relaying meaning and understanding. So what he speaks about is basically conceptual translation rather than lexical translation. Because when you do lexical translation, or you relate lexical items to each other, then you look at the labels only and not necessarily what is actually behind the label. And we emphasized earlier in this class that the real problem for learning a language, for people who learn a new language, is conceptualization. So what is the conceptual load that is attached to that particular lexical item? Because as far as literal meaning is concerned, we know very well that there is a match most of the time. However, the metaphorical domain that is attached to those two labels in two different languages, there is no match there. So that's what Williams refers to as far as translanguaging is more than just translating, you know, because basically what we had to do here is relying on the conceptual side of the matter. There is another thing that they mention, and it is Colin Baker's, you know Colin Baker because he used his book when you took my bilingualism class. So he discusses 4 potential educational advantages to translanguaging. He says that it may promote a deeper and fuller understanding of the subject matter. It may help the development of the weaker language. It may facilitate homeschool links and cooperation, and it may help the integration of fluent speakers with their learners. That's all fine, you know, but again, what bothers me in this whole thing, I mean, in this whole book, in fact, that there are no examples, demonstrative examples that show what these guys actually mean by this. Let me show you something here that I try to highlight and even try to use an example to demonstrate what they actually meant. There was a, yeah, here it is. Here this is. When they talk about the neurolinguists, and they refer to Guzman Theory's work, and Guzman Theory actually refers to this relationship between the signs. So he says that there is some really good learning where the speaker encodes definitions in one language and retrieves related object names in the target language, but there is no example. So what he means by this, I used an example here. So, you know, you learn the definition of table in one language, and then you retrieve the object name in the other language, der Tisch, in German. So the issue here is that, okay, you learn the definition in one language, and then you retrieve the same kind of concept through another label in the other language. This is good. This works all right. So this cross-language semantic remapping is something very good, but only for concrete objects. You know, how about more abstract concepts? So where there is no one-to-one relationship as far as the lexicon is concerned. So this is where the real issue, the real problem is, because as far as objects are concerned, you know, of course, you know, you can learn the definition of that object in one language, and then you retrieve the label, you know, that is related to that in the other language. There is no problem with that. The problem is between labels where actually we have a lot of difference as far as metaphorical domain is concerned, or abstract concepts, you know, which sometimes do not even exist in the other language. So, of course, this kind of relationship works very well for certain things, but not necessarily for others. Okay, any questions about these issues? So the advantages of translanguaging and the advantage of semantic remapping in translanguaging. If not, there is one more thing that I want to discuss before I give the floor to Yingru. And this is about emergent bilinguals. So Garcia and Li Wei say that emergent bilinguals do not acquire a separate additional language, but develop and integrate new language practices into a complex dynamic bilingual repertoire in which translanguaging is both the supportive context and the community web itself. So when I read this passage, I was thinking about my approach to pragmatic competence. Because when I talk about pragmatic competence, I say that when you learn a second language, you already have one pragmatic competence that is based on your first language. So you have some kind of guidelines for your language behavior that is based on the first language. So when you start to develop some kind of language behavior patterns in the second language, it doesn't mean that you start from scratch. There is already something there. that there is already the pragmatic competence based on the first language. So you do not need to develop everything from scratch. You have to rely, or you can rely actually quite a lot of things that you have learned through the first language. But the only thing that you have to do is to do some kind of modifications. So why do I say this? Because what they actually emphasize about translanguaging is mainly based on not necessarily on the linguistic side of the matter, as we have said several times, but on the conceptual side of the matter. Because what they describe about emergent bilinguals here is very good as far as their, for example, their pragmatic competence is concerned. So I would agree with that wholeheartedly, because when I read this text, I said, well, this is absolutely something that I can agree with, but not necessarily the way, as they say, but it is some kind of part of the language knowledge that we call the knowledge of the language, but not the whole, okay? So this is the real issue here, as far as I'm concerned, that, definitely we have emergent bilinguals, and emergent bilinguals have linguistic issues and sociocultural issues and conceptual issues. And as far as conceptual issues are concerned, there is this kind of thing that actually you have already know several things based on the first language. But as far as the code is concerned, that's another thing. Because you are a Chinese person and you start to learn English, the English code is almost uncomparable to the Chinese code. There is no overlap. There is very little that you can kind of use from your Chinese as far as the English code is concerned. And that is true, even if, if you take other languages, like, for example, Russian and German or something like that. Okay. Or Portuguese and English. Roberto may kind of say something about that. But I don't know whether you understand what my point here is. So do you, or do you have any comments to that?
So what the professor is saying, that we already have pragmatic competence in our L1, and when you begin to learn L2, you have to sort of do the kind of, I don't know.
You have to modify. You have to modify that, but you already have some pragmatic competence, very strong.
Right.
Yes, that is your basic interpersonal skills, So after all, there is nothing, there is not that much to learn from scratch. The real thing is some kind of modification. But my point is that as far as the code is concerned, you cannot say the same thing about the code. That's the issue here, because you can say what they say about the pragmatic competence, for example. But you cannot say the same about the code, because if you compare, the pragmatic competence that you have gained in Swahili, for example, and then you start to learn English, you have learned a lot of things in Swahili as far as behavioral patterns and things are concerned that will work in English, and some of the others will not work in English. So you have to modify that. But you have to have at least 20% or 30% of your pragmatic competence that you gain through Swahili that will work in English as well. It depends on how the closeness of the language is culturally and not linguistically, of course. Okay. So, but as far as the code is concerned, you can hardly see this kind of typological thing there, unless you have really close languages like Slavic languages, like Bulgarian and Russian, for example, or Dutch and English or something like that, So people who read my book, Foreign Language and Mother Tongue, you remember that I talk about language typology and psychotypology. And, this is what it is connected with, So after all, we have to be careful here, because I'm still debating this unitary system thing, that we have talked about several times. That Yes, certainly. There is I'm absolutely for that the pragmatic competence has some kind of unitary system there, but not necessarily the linguistic system. It's another time. So this is where we have to keep the two things separate. So their overemphasis of the unitary system is my problem, not that actually there is no unitariness there. There is some. Of course, we share things, no matter even if our cultures are quite far from each other, but we share things as far as communication is concerned. Okay, and that's an important issue, I think.
Wait, so is pragmatic competence part of linguistic competence or the unitary system?
Well,
separate?
I go back to my chart, the common underlying conceptual base and the
Yes.
general kind of issue, because as far as pragmatic competence are concerned, it is for me the common underlying conceptual base issue. So as far as the two languages generals are concerned, that is strictly the labels and how the labels are organized by the grammatical rules there. So that is what it is. Okay, now I have to stop here and give the floor to Yingru to make her presentation, interview presentation.
Okay.
Wait a minute, I have to stop sharing first. Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna share my screen.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
So, yeah. So today, my presentation is about an interview I had with one of my friends who's working in Dali University at Foreign Languages. And we discussed about the translanguaging approach she employed in her English news writing class. Okay, so here's the basic agenda of today's presentation. I'm gonna introduce the background of the student and the instructor, and then we're gonna take a close look of the teaching resources they have in class, including the textbooks and other materials. And then we'll have a look of the in-class teaching activities, mostly focused on the translanguaging approach that she employed. And then we're gonna have a look of the after-class assignments. Most of them are writing assignments. And then we're gonna have a look of the basic skills development of the students. And in the end are some reflections and discussion. Okay, so first, as you can see here, the student, she has like 30 students in her class, and the name of the class is called English News Writing. And those students are from the School of Journalism and then Communication. There are majors in journalism and communication, and Chinese language and literature, and a few of them are from the archaic Chinese major. And their language background, the first language is Chinese and their second language is English. And all the students have passed CET 6 or 4, which is the National English.
Sorry,
Foreign
are you on slide number 2 or still slide number 1?
I'm on number 2. You cannot see it?
Yeah, we cannot see you move to number 2.
Let me check. How about now?
It's loading. Yes, number 2. Can you try move to slide number 3? Just in case, so we don't interrupt you when you speak. Okay, that's good. Okay.
Works. Okay, thank you. Yeah. And yeah, so the students' English level are like a college English level 6, which is National English as a foreign language test for undergraduate student. And the instructor herself is a Chinese-English bilingual, and she majors in English language and literature, and 2-year college teaching experience. So now let's take a look of the teaching goals of this class. So the English news writing class is a selective course for non-English major undergraduates. And the major goal, the primary goal for this course is to learn the industry practices in the US and Britain and get a general understanding of the similarities and the differences between English and the Chinese news writing and reporting. This is their major concern. And besides that, they hope this course can help the students to develop the basic skills needed to produce English news stories. So here's the textbook they use. And this textbook is totally in English, and it includes the vocabulary and some news report model text, and also instructions on English news writing. Okay. So besides the textbook, the instructor's PowerPoints she uses in class is totally English. And also, she's gonna select some news text from the major newspapers, like the Times, the Sun, the Guardian, and the New York Times. Okay, and besides those written materials, they also have some like video materials, like film clippings on journalism, and also some news videos in both English and Chinese. Okay, and here's about the in-class teaching system. So for in the in-class teaching period, they're gonna first of all take a look of the vocabulary of the model text in their textbook. That will be a standard English news report. Because those students are not English major, even though they have the basic knowledge about English and can do simple conversation in English. But when it comes to news, their vocabulary is very limited. So it is necessary for them to accumulate some of the vocabulary. And then when they go in details of the model text, the teacher is gonna ask them questions, mainly in English, and focus on the structure, the organization of the text, the news report. And for the students, they don't need to answer in English, but they can try their best. The teacher allow them to answer in Chinese or mix them at the same time. And then they will also discuss the English news writing skills in class. So, and then also they're gonna compare the Chinese news report with the English news report, compare the different organization and similarities and then the differences. So that is their first concern of conducting this course. So in this part, the instructor gonna mainly use Chinese for the sake of students' comprehension. So when we talk about why she doesn't use the English as a medium of instruction method, because she told me that it depends on the student's language proficiency level, and it will be quite challenging and difficult for those students if she deliver the whole class in totally English. And then also when it comes to the news writing, those are like a content knowledge. She's afraid that students may have like shallow understanding of what they are discussing about. That is why she's gonna using like translanguaging in order to reduce students' comprehension difficulties and also boost students' confidence in class while they are discussing those questions, so because they can answer in Chinese. Okay, and for the in-class writing activities, the instructor gave them, she will choose some of the English news from those apps. and then delete the headline or the lead part, and then ask the students to write the headline or lead for the given news. And in this part, sometimes they do English to English, which means it is an English news report and they need to add in English headline or lead. Sometimes they do it in Chinese for with the given text. They are required to come up with a Chinese headline and write the lead in Chinese. And then when they are done, the teacher, when it enters the peer review phase, or the teacher comments on their writing, they will mostly use in Chinese. Okay. And then besides that, they also have the in-class student group activity, which is a group presentation of a full news report in English, like totally English, and a relatively longer one than compared to the one given in their like writing activities. So the students can use both Chinese and English, discuss with their group members and design their like slides. And then they are required to give their own opinions on the current news report with their knowledge, what they learned in this class, and also compare it to their knowledge on their major, because they are journalism and communication major, but most of their like writings are in Chinese, so they are expected to compare the English news and Chinese news when it comes to writing skills. But they can present their slides in Chinese or English. And I asked her, but she told me when it comes to terminology, so those students are quite familiar with all the terminologies of journalism and the communication in Chinese, even though they learn some terminology in this class in English, but students tend to, they prefer use Chinese terminology, use the terminology in Chinese. Yeah. And besides those in-class activities, they also have their after-class writing assignments. So for their after-class writing assignments, the teacher sometimes will give them an English story. So it could be an English story she chose from the website, or sometimes she will re-edit a new English news report into a narrative, into a story, and then ask the students to edit into a Chinese news report. That's it, from English to Chinese. And sometimes the students will be given a Chinese anecdote, a Chinese story, and then they are required to re-edit the Chinese story into an English news report. That's from Chinese to English. Yeah. And then we can take a look of how they achieve the language objectives. So as I mentioned earlier, the main focus for this course is to let the student have a general understanding of what it looks like when it comes to a news report in English, because they are like a Chinese major or a Chinese journalism communication major. So they have a good knowledge of the journalism in Chinese, but when it comes to English, they have very limited knowledge. But so even though this is their primary concern, besides that, they also help the students can develop the basic skills in English when it comes to news reporting and producing news. So when for the listening skills, they kind of try to improve them by watching those ancient news. And also the challenge point for the student will be some proper nouns appears in the news because they are not familiar with those words. So as they are taking this course, they start learning and accumulating more words. So gradually their listening skills improve a lot. And besides that, for speaking part, they can practice it in group presentation, news analysis, and also sometimes they are required to read news or sometimes paraphrase the news in English or in Chinese at the same time. And then for the reading skills are coming from those assignments before class study materials and in class news stories, as well as the reading and the writing assignment the teacher gave them. So all those are in English. And the most important point for students to develop is the writing skills of an English news report. So the teacher told me that a noticeable progress in news writing can be detected from their weekly assignment from the first week until the end of semester. Through those writing assignments, she can tell a great progress of those students in news writing in English. And then this part, I'm gonna come to some reflection and discussion. So as we discussed, she told me she thinks the successfulness of adopting the translanguaging approach in her class lies in the following 2 points. One is to facilitate content learning and comprehension, because it could be very difficult for those students to learn the whole English news writing skills in totally English. It's like impossible because they cannot understand it, like 100% understand it, and sometimes it may distract them from like content learning. And the second one is to reduce students' anxiety and also boost their confidence in communication. The teachers want them to share more knowledge, what they know on in the field of journalism and communication. So she doesn't want the language proficiency be hindered or difficulty for them to express their ideas. And we can tell the successfulness of this class by the popularities of this class. This class has been conducted in 2 years, and there are a great number of students selecting this course. And also we can tell the successfulness of it from the students' progress in knowledge level and the language level when it comes to English news writing. And the second thing is the problem that the instructor pointed out is about using the translation app or website, because the students were given the Chinese English written assignments, but sometimes not everyone, but for a few students, they may go for the translation app and then just to put all the whole Chinese story in the translation website and then translate it to English, and then try to re-edit it based on those translated version of the English story and re-edit it into a news report. But the teacher can tell because there are some problem with the machine translation, and the English report they were written sometimes has a you can see the influence of the Chinese language and the Chinese language structure are reflected in their English writing assignments. So the instructor pointed out to her students, they may lose a lot of points if they were found using those kind of like translation app. But she does encourage students to use some resources to help them analyzing the original story and then to improve their English writing, but not by just translate the whole text into English online. And also, we discussed about the influence of translanguaging approach in content class and the language classes. Because the class she's teaching is a selective course in the School of Journalism and Communication, so which is formally the Department of Chinese Language. So the student, so for this course, it is a content class. So for her teaching goal is to let them have a general idea of the differences between Chinese news and English news. So it is a very good approach, a very helpful one to use translanguaging in class. But when we discuss about language classes, I asked her insights or ideas about translanguaging conduction in language class, and she told me that depends on the teaching objectives. As we discussed earlier in this class, I think, yeah, in China, to be honest, that translanguaging, when it comes to like English language learning, is not that appreciative, even though we employ it when it comes to understanding some difficult terminology, difficult words, and we use the grammar translation method. But the instructors all hope the students can, and they also think it is very effective to employ the immersive language learning process to let the students only use and think and speak in English for most of the time in class as much as possible. And then we do compare her class to those English major courses in China. And but in Dalian University of Foreign Languages, so basically all the courses for English major are conducted in totally English with no Chinese. But besides, some classes when it comes to English linguistics or literature courses for postgraduate student, we have this type of class. It's like a seminar with just around 10 students of the same advisor gonna discuss about the linguistics and the literature. While we are having those kind of classes, we will use both language. We will do the translanguaging of English and the Chinese, but not in the majority of the courses for undergraduate students for English major. And also, she pointed out another thing is that in China, it is hard for the students to do translanguaging of English and Chinese naturally outside the classroom. Because she asked me about the situation here in the States, and I told her about those bilingual programs in K-12 or even college. And then for example, the students here can do translanguaging in their daily life in Spanish or English, sometimes in Chinese and English if you go to the Chinese speaking area like Chinatown. But in China, unless you are working in a foreign company or those kind of English language circle, besides that, the students can hardly actually do translanguaging outside classroom. And she says that when it comes to language teaching and learning, she does hope her students can spend more time focus on English, just practice it like totally in English. That will help them improve their language skills. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, I think it's about the time, but I don't know, because I do interview another person.
Okay.
But I don't know if we have time for go to one more slide or.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure that we're gonna have here some questions.
Okay, we can. Yeah, we can discuss about the questions, and if we have more time, I can share another interview. The reason I didn't choose that is because it's not a typical reflection of translanguaging approach in class. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you have any questions to her? I found the class quite interesting, you know, because it's a really good class where they are expected to learn how to create English news, basically, linguistically, because the important thing is, but at the same time, of course, that requires a lot of information as well, and that information can come through the Chinese language as well. And but just one thing that basically it makes sense that in this class they use translanguaging. So I think the nature of the class requires the use of translanguaging, absolutely. And what you demonstrated, it's basically the teacher uses that quite well. Okay, what do you think? Or do you have any comments?
I have a comment,
Yeah.
which is, it seemed to me, correct me if I'm wrong, if I misunderstood, but we were talking about like the two types of approaches, like not approaches, but like contexts for using translanguaging. One where it's there's the content, and one where the language is the target, the objective. And it seemed to me that that class is sort of like a mix of both, because I got the impression that because the goal, one of the goals was the writing.
Yeah.
That part, that writing in English, that part was like no translanguaging in the writing. But then in the speaking about the process, where it was teaching, like, because the news writing was the content. So when we came to speaking, then we would use translanguaging as we talked about the content, which was writing. But when we got to the writing, it was like the language, and then therefore there was more translanguaging orally than writing. Is that a fair assessment? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, we do discuss about what Roberto had mentioned about the writing assignment part. So the production is like totally English. Yeah, you are right with that. So in that part, they don't do a mixed language, like do the reporting in Chinese and English. So it comes to one of the questions, we discussed about the standard language. So when it comes to journalism and the communication, she told me that if the student write the news report in both English and the Chinese, is not the standard for the news, just for the journalism field. I mean, in China and also here, right? We don't makes the language do translanguaging when it's come to writing. Yeah, so yeah, and that is one of the reasons. Yeah, I have another slide. If we have time, we can just go back. When it comes to the discussion about so-called a standard language, because I have another friend who's a high school English teacher in Croatia, in Europe, and during that interview, we discussed about the so-called standard language, because she pointed out that sometimes in Croatian, the Croatian language teacher had concerns on students' English expressions in Croatian. And she gives me an example about, for example, when they say like Pula Film Festival, most of students will say it in Croatian, but in English way. Like, how to say that? Pulaski films, something like festival. Yeah, but actually,
Pula is a town in Croatia. So
it's a coastal
regular
city.
film festival there, so that's why it is called Pula Film Festival, because the town's name is Pula. So if you look at the map, you will find Pula close to the sea.
Right. So yeah, and she told me that the way to say it in Croatian is a Filmski Festival Upoli. Yeah, like that. And they don't do, I mean, she told me according to Croatian grammar, they don't do like a noun, like a Pula Film Festival, all the nouns put them together. So they can acquire it while you are talking in Croatian, and then you have such kind of expression. For those native language teachers, it's a problem for them. So they require the student to use standard language, no matter it's in English or in Croatian. You just insist with, well, that is her experience with her colleagues. So we do discuss about the role of translanguaging in language class. It's not like a final product for example, like the one we have in the English writing class, they are not, or they should not produce a news report in the mixed language of Chinese and English, and that is why, yeah. And then when it comes to the language learning also, so for those students gonna use English in their workplace, that depends on the circumstances, but sometimes you are required, expected to be very professional. For example, like a translator, interpreter, insists in one language, like we discussed about the standard language. So yeah, so I also, yeah, I want to, maybe we can discuss about that. So what do you think of it's like a translanguaging is like a transitional phase in class, but it's not the final product of the class.
The previous class, the Chinese class, is really interesting because as I think it was Roberto who mentioned that this is more like a mixture of the two types of classes where we focus only on the target language or we focus on the content. And there is another thing why that class was very important, because of the fact that we discussed just before the interview, that there are tasks there that require conceptualization, reconceptualization, and there are tasks there that require linguistic work, basically. So when the teacher gave the task to the students to write an English news about a Chinese event or something like that, of course, that absolutely requires some kind of reconceptualization of the whole thing, you know. And it was, I think you even showed a slide where there was an opposite thing, you know, where they had to write something where the original information was in English, and then they had to create a Chinese kind of news about the whole thing, you know. Right. And there was another thing that I want to call your attention to, which I liked very much. At the very beginning, when you mentioned that when you create an English piece of news, then you use like an upside down pyramid, where you put the most important information at the beginning, and then you elaborate, you know, which is one of the most important issues for Chinese people, you know, because their language requires presenting the ideas in an topic associating way. Topic associating means that you give facts, pieces of information, and then at the beginning and at the end, you pull the whole thing together and make your point. In English, we do that the opposite way, so a topic-centered way. So the English approach is a topic-centered way, where you make the topic, so you name the topic, and you make your most important point, and then you elaborate on that. So that's an opposite thing. So it's very important for the Chinese students to learn that, and there was word about that at the very beginning, you know. So after that's and again, you know, that helps the students to reconceptualize the whole process and then feel it with language, in fact. So, you know, this is really good. I like the idea of this class very much.
Thank you.
Other people say something. Uzu, how did you like it?
Yeah, so I wanted to make a comment about when she said about the successfulness of the class, so that try to boost to reduce the anxiety so that they can boost their participation in the class. So I wanted to, like, not just a question, but to agree with that concept, because some people have anxiety issues when they have to deal with a language that they're not so comfortable with. So I thought that was a very good strategy. What I may add or ask in that regard was, how did she boost their confidence, you know, to deal with the anxiety issues so that they don't like get, you know, caught up when they have some challenges?
Yeah, when they're like analyzing a English news text in class, and sometimes students have problem of first difficulty will be understanding the original English text. And sometimes the teacher will ask them to like paraphrase it or explain it in English, but they could be very stressful because they don't know how to organize their thoughts in English. But at this time, they are allowed to use Chinese too. So they can share their ideas of which part they understand, and they can say that in Chinese, and then also point it out, raise question in Chinese to tell the instructor that, okay, as for this part, I don't quite get the idea, and what's the why, because of the understanding the concept or the words, those things. And also when they are comparing the English news and Chinese news, it will be very challenging for them to do it like totally in English. They cannot do it. And if you force them to use English, you will get very limited information from the students, but actually they know more. So the instructor encouraged them to like use Chinese, just use Chinese to compare what do you think the differences between those two news report. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay,
Good
and
job.
Isabel.
I just wanted to ask, because I think there was also a very interesting task, and I think it also involved reconceptualization. So there was one task where they had headlines in English and Chinese, and they had to reconceptualize in the other language.
Yeah, they
Right?
have the instructor find an original English news report, but she will get rid of the highline and the lead maybe sometimes, and just show them the main part of this English news report, and then ask the students to write a highline for this news or a lead for this news. Sometimes they do it in English, sometimes they do it in Chinese.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I think I got it wrong, because I thought that they were given headlines, so they would somehow reconceptualize them in a different language too.
Yeah.
And then I was wondering how she would support the activity, because, you know, that involves a lot of not just translation itself, it involves the way of writing headlines. It involved also different social, cultural, you know, ways of or the preferred ways of saying things and organizing those headlines. So I was just, you know, my question was, how did she support that reconceptualization of headlines?
Yeah, I think she did, but she also mentioned that she should get more knowledge on that part herself, so that she can get more support, not only in that part, also in the student group project, the presentation part. But yeah, so the students sometimes when they're required to get an English highline, they discuss it. So they compare of the different highlights coming from the students in class, and they compare it. And she's kind of gave them a good example answer. And the student, and they're pointing out their the problem of their highline or of their leads. For example, if it is not, it does not cover the main idea of the news report. Yeah, things like that.
Yeah, because I just thought it brought me back to one of the writing classes that I had at the university, and one of the parts of that course was news headlines and news writing. And I do remember that we were not allowed translanguaging at all, and we would have more contained exercises where we would look at actual headlines in English, and we were asked to, you know, compare it to the way we would say it in Spanish and try to figure out what were some of the differences, I guess, but not just the writing itself, not just the translation itself, but the style of writing them that would come with a different reconceptualization of how you write news, apart from just the structure.
Yeah, that is also a good point. I can share with her later. Yeah, so yeah, just comparing the highlights, try to use it in two languages and compare them. Yeah.
Well, because I was thinking that if you're asking all the students to generate those headlines without having some training or having some ideas of what they would look like, then anything can go, you know what I mean? So how do they know what's the target? What's the supposed way of writing that headline?
Yeah, so it's about the news writing skills in English when it comes to highline. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I think that we all can agree that this has been a very good example for translanguaging, where actually translanguaging has been used very positively and for the benefit of the students. Okay, now we deserve a break, so it's like 7 minutes to 6, so we're gonna meet at 6:03. Okay, and we'll continue with
specialized ideas she uses in each class. So what she does is she, again, because almost all of her students are native English speakers or have a good command of English, she begins the course, and depending on how far along the course is, that, you know, the classes, mostly in English, and then she adds Hebrew until uses only Hebrew, and that's towards the end of the course. During the course of the course, sorry for the tautology there, she mostly is using English, and then based on her judgment, she's putting in Hebrew, and then she keeps trying to increase the amount of Hebrew. But if she feels that the students are confused or not making progress, she falls back on the English. And so what she has is a strategy she learned from CUNY, and it's called preview, view, review. So you preview the topic in English, where you make connections and share prior knowledge on a topic. So the students connect with what they know about a topic. And I asked her for some good topics, and she said basic things that are very important, like looking for a new apartment and signing up for internet service. And then you view the topic in Hebrew as much as the students up until that point she feels can understand. Again, as the class progresses, she can use more Hebrew and discuss more sophisticated topics. And then you review the topic in English. So basically you're going back and forth between the two languages. And then you just discuss, summarize, and analyze what you just saw in Hebrew about the topic. And so that clarifies what was learned, and that solidifying the understanding of the content. And there's also another strategy she learned called KWL. And what basically, whenever they decide to open a new topic, they discuss first what they already know about the topic, what they already know about the topic, what they want to learn about the topic in Hebrew. So they discuss what they know about the topic in English, and then they describe what they want to know about the topic in Hebrew. And then afterward, again, first mostly in English, but then progressing more to Hebrew, what have I learned about the topic, using both languages back and forth. And then she also has them use some ongoing strategies outside of class. One thing, and this is in Israel, there's a lot of volunteers that will help new immigrants assimilate and to learn. And they have a program called Bilingual Buddies, which she encourages them to sign up for. And basically they're paired with a volunteer from the outside community who is versed in the methods of her methods of starting mostly in English and then progressing into Hebrew, and to keep adding Hebrew to the conversation. And this is something they would do outside of class, but it really helps with their language skills and just getting along in society also. And then she also as they make progress, she also encourages to translate for family and friends. Again, this is blurring the boundary between direct translation and translingualism, but again, it's an opportunity to use both languages at the same time. And then she also has them keep translingual diaries. Just give you a little example again here, where, and this is something, because they're adults, they can compare languages for metalinguistic awareness. Just to give you a brief idea, like just a very superficial idea. For example, Hebrew doesn't have any vowels that you write. So when they're writing, if they're having trouble in terms of writing, if they examine their diaries and they compare their English to their Hebrew, they can kind of see where in Hebrew they would say the vowels, but they wouldn't write them. And so it will help them more with their Hebrew writing and going back and forth writing between the two languages. And then she has some reading strategies. So what they do is, again, they read text in English and discuss in Hebrew to the greatest extent possible. And then also going back, read text in Hebrew and discuss in English. I say discuss in English, but basically using, again, the goal is to try to use as much Hebrew as possible, but understanding that they need to scaffold it first with their English. So going back and forth between both ways and trying to use more and more Hebrew as they go along. And then another thing is a lot of newspapers publish both in Hebrew and English. So if they read those to get those newspapers, they can go back and forth between the two languages and make connections between them. Another idea is to read the same book in English and Hebrew simultaneously. And whenever they do, to apply the preview, view, review, and KWL strategies when discussing all the texts. And another thing they have is writing partners. So what she does is she pairs the students for writing about a topic together, and they brainstorm in both languages and then decide on a topic for presentation, and then jointly construct writing in Hebrew. So the result is writing in Hebrew informed and improved by their negotiation in English. So then what they do is, and these are groups, the groups then exchange their writings for review and analysis according to criteria she has, grammar, vocabulary, content, and they can comment in either or both languages. And then also too, when they become, they're more confident in their writing, they can, outside of class, individually prepare translingual writing for in-class exchange and analysis. And so just to get them confident for it, she can tell them, I want you to prepare something outside of class on any topic you want, and you can use as much English or Hebrew as you feel comfortable with, so that they don't feel like they have to write perfectly in Hebrew, and they can gain knowledge of Hebrew as they feel more and more confident writing in it. There's also some listening comprehension activities where they go back and forth between, so listen to an audio book in Hebrew of a previously read English book. So if they read something before in English, then they listen to it in Hebrew and they can make connections between them. Summarize and translate podcasts using both languages and describe in class using both languages. And then to watch English movies with Hebrew subtitles and watch Hebrew movies with English subtitles. And then one of the major goals is to prepare them for working. And this is something, of course, as we just know how frightening it is to go on a job interview when we're very familiar with the language. But you know, if you're looking for a job and you're not entirely familiar with the language, it's very anxiety producing. So what she has them do is identify someone with working knowledge of both languages. And generally speaking, I would say that all of Israeli society, and except for the very, very perhaps older generation, is more or less bilingual at this point. So they probably wouldn't have trouble finding someone who has working knowledge of both languages, who is in their desired career field. This is just someone to help them, not someone they're interviewing with them. So they would practice, for example, if they were going on a job interview, and they would develop a set of questions in both Hebrew and English. And before they meet with the person in class, they would form pairs in which to practice asking the questions. And then they would attempt to conduct the interview. Again, you're going in pairs. One person is working with the as the interviewer, and one's working with the interviewee. And they would attempt continue taking turns of practicing in class until they feel ready to interview the real person who is going to give them information about the job that they might want in the future. And after they work with the outside person that they interview, is to report their ability to understand and speak Hebrew, the proportion of the interview conducted in each languages, and their successes and challenges with that. And then I just gave an idea, why is Israel an ideal site for translanguaging? Again, you have a bilingual, multilingual society. So again, you have a very good opportunity, if you don't know Hebrew, to go back and forth between at least English and Hebrew. And depending what community you go into, it could be Russian and English and Hebrew, or Amharic. There's a lot of Ethiopian immigrants also, depending on where you go. And then you have immigrants from many different countries with different first languages. And another thing is that modern Hebrew was invented with the birth of, there was always been ancient Hebrew, but after Israel was became a country in 1948, they needed a modern version of Hebrew, so it had to be quickly updated. So Hebrew contains many English-derived words. If you listen to it, you know, you can hear, you're listening to Hebrew, then you hear the word computer. And so, again, it's very, that eases going back and forth between the two languages. And also, Hebrew and English are often used in the same media. And this is just something interesting I wanted to point out, because I do have a friend who used to be a journalist. He's now a PhD student here in Israel. And basically, because everything with the internet, more and more publications are only appearing in English and not in Hebrew anymore. So I'm curious if in the future, if the immigrants will eventually not have to learn Hebrew, except as maybe a cultural type of endeavor. But it's really interesting how, if you look at more and more reading, it's just appearing in English only. So that's my presentation. I just had some questions for you, and feel free to ask me any questions you have. If you have any comment on which strategies you think are more effective, less effective. And I'm really curious, probably with the third question, is which strategies do you think you could use with your students? Again, depending on who your students are. And also too, if you have any questions for me or for Esther. So if there's anything you'd like to ask, please feel free.
Elaine, I have a question about Esther's opinion about translanguaging, because we have received an excellent summary of her activities, but what does she really think about translanguaging, using translanguaging in her classes? And you said that she had some experience with the program that was initiated by SUNY, I think.
Yeah.
Mentioned that, and she had some experience with that while she was here in the United States. And then when she went to Israel, she basically implemented some of those things in translanguaging. So what was your opinion about?
That's a really good question. And I completely, that's something that I'm facing too in my own work with adult students. And before when she was in New York, she found it, she wasn't sure of its utility. She found it very difficult to use because her classes were composed of students from many different languages. And I kind of have that view. I find it, again, my opinion is it's less useful if you have students from many different first languages. But when she went to Israel, she realized how beneficial it was when you're only dealing with two languages. So I have that, and this was, I was thinking of at the beginning of class 2. My opinion on translanguaging at this point is I think it's very useful. For example, if I was back teaching in South Florida, where almost all of my students are from a native Spanish speaking background, I would find it very useful, but I'm not sure how I don't want to use the word useful, but how easy it would be to use it when students from many different language backgrounds. So she likes it. She's very much likes it now, but she wasn't so keen on it back in New York City.
I see. Okay, any more questions to Elaine about the presentation or the teacher, Esther?
I hope that's,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It was really engaging for me, and it made me to think about some stuff like translanguaging in my own native language in Nigeria, for instance. When you talked about the third question, which strategies do you think one could use with students? I wanted also to bring this to the class before now or much later. For instance, in a special education classroom, there's what we call adaptation. Adaptation is, for instance, if you have a text and you check the level of students' understanding of high level grammar in English, we have a way of synthesizing and breaking it down in a very low level vocabulary. So I want to say, for instance, when we have a mixture of students in the classroom, to what extent can we apply this strategy you have used in such a setting?
You know, I was just thinking in Nigeria, because I know that the BBC now publishes in Pidgin for the, have you seen that for the, so I mean, just off the top of my head, if you're dealing with, depending on the class you're dealing with, I would, you can get the same BBC article, for example, if you're teaching reading in Pidgin and in British English, and you can compare them. So that's the kind of strategy that I would think of right off the top of my head. Is that kind of what you're asking about, or? You know?
Yeah, it's close to it actually, because where I was going with that was, excuse me, where I was going with that was like, there's this perception, like in Nigeria, for instance, most of the textbooks are written in English language. So the argument is this: what will happen if teachers are meant to teach those, for instance, chemistry, physics, biology, mathematics, in our first language? How would that be like? What will it look like? Will it involve maybe translating the entire textbook to native language so that students can perform better? I don't know if there's a side that says that anyways. I'm just thinking around this when you are presenting. I say I should just put it across. Maybe someone has a better idea to give me.
I'm not sure, you know, the thing is, I guess it depends too. I mean, because I know when again, you're from Nigeria, I'm not, but the thing is that I know that depending on the students, some come with a very, depending on the school they go to. You know, if they go to a private school, they come with a very good command of standard English, where students who maybe go to a public school don't. But again, I think that in terms of the subject matter, depending what it is to give them, starting off with giving them a basis of the difference between the English they learned and the English that they need to know from the text. I think maybe I'm just throwing out an idea. Maybe something a teacher could do is if there's a lesson on biology, and I'm just saying, if typically in Nigeria, it's probably written in British English, the teacher could translate, I don't know, that's just the word, could basically simplify the English, depending if they're used to speaking Pidgin, or translate it into one of the Nigerian languages, and then add more words as the course progresses. That's basically what I got from Esther, is doing the gradual approach, in terms of, so that might require some more work. The teacher might have to go out of his or her way to translate the lesson, and then provide a basis of it in the native language, and then use more and more of the standard English.
Yeah, but there is a real issue here, because as far as Esther's work was concerned, she was working with immigrants, and she wanted to prepare them for everyday life. So all the topics that she focused on were connected with everyday life, and basically there was no lexical problem, no conceptual problem, that more like conceptual problem. There were conceptual problems, but not necessarily lexical problems. But you mentioned the Nigerian situation. If you want to teach, for example, biology, the real problem for me is that biology has its own vocabulary. It has its own terminology. So you cannot play there, with the dialects or Pidgin or other kind of ways, because you either know the terminology or you do not know the terminology. So if you want to learn something about biology, you must know the terminology. So there is no way to get rid of that. And the other thing is that if you want to translate that to another language, the problem is, of course, to find the right terminology. And we talked about this issue at the beginning of the course, that every single human language is able to develop a particular vocabulary that the speakers of that language need. Okay? So the question is, of course, that the language, like, for example, if we go to the Maori situation in New Zealand, their major problem is that there is no terminology in the Maori language to translate a content area like physics, biology, and other subjects into Maori. So what do? Because they just cannot create terminology in Maori when there is none. So after all, the same thing in Nigeria, if you want to teach biology, and want to use one of the local languages, because you will not find the right way to translate that, to conceptualize the actual notion in that particular language. So that's a basic problem, as far as revitalization of languages or use of languages for academic purposes and stuff like that. So, going back to the Israeli situation, there it was absolutely possible for Esther to kind of use a kind of gradual approach to this whole thing. But you cannot do that in Nigeria with biology. So that's the real problem. Any other opinions?
Professor, I was thinking there are languages like, for example, the Spanish, that, with the invention of this new specialized terminology coming from everywhere, there's the Royal Academy, the Spanish Academy, that actually tries forcibly to translate those into the Spanish language. And they do quite a good job, but the population are not picking up on those terms. They're using the terms in the original languages. So there's
Yeah,
also
you know,
that thing.
that's a very good point, you know, because this is what happened in France. This is what happened in Iran before the revolution, you know, because they had in Iran, they had an academy just like you have in Spain that wanted to kind of keep up the quality of the language, you know. The same thing in France, you know, that they try to kind of preserve the language from English influence and stuff like that, and try to kind of create labels for existing concepts in the given language. But the problem is whether the users will take that or not. Everything depends on, you know, you can try to do whatever. This is what we see nowadays with the pronouns, for example. That, you know, people try to kind of use all kinds of pronouns. The question is whether the language will take it or not. You know, you can do whatever you want. It's the decision of the language, because the language is used by the whole society. And, you know, you can force the language to do this or that, but what if the language doesn't want to do that? You know,
a great example of this falling in line with what you're saying, Professor, is what happened with the Olympics, when the Winter Olympics, when the North Korean hockey team joined with the South Korean hockey team. The language of North Korea hasn't progressed with the rest of the world in the same way, so that all of these concepts, you know, that they had appeared fossilized in time to the South Korean team.
Exactly. So, you know, the language is a wonderful thing, you know, it's an absolutely wonderful tool, but it doesn't want you to interfere into its business. You know, you can try to do that. Many thousands of people have tried to do that. You know, George Bernard Shaw left all his money on reforming English writing, you know, and that was millions that time. It was an enormous amount of money. And what happened? Look what kind of writing we have in English, you know. So how do you write, for example, women? You use O and E to denote basically the same sound, you know. So that's terrible. Nobody could change that, you know. People wanted to change that. So language is very interesting, you know, because it is used by a lot of people, and of course it is accepting certain developments in the society and doesn't accept other developments. But if the speakers need something very much, the language will go and do that, you know. So this is how it works, you know, and we cannot do that much against that, you know. So we can try, of course, as I say, there have been a lot of hundreds of examples, you know, interference into language development. But, you know, it's a slow process, and language is a reflection of society, you know. Nobody doubts that. And what we have in language, that is societal, basically. So after all, you know, if we need something, as I said several times, language will reflect that. Language will show that. Language will accept that, you know. However, if there is something there, you know, that only not that many people want to do, the language will not accept it, period. You know, you cannot, there are countries, you know, where, I don't know whether I talked about something very important that happened in Hungary in the 19th century. You know, that was during the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, you know, so that was something like that in Europe, and that was the biggest country in the whole Europe. And the important thing was that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire has two languages, German and Hungarian. But the German was a dominant language, so in most of the schools, you know, they used German and less Hungarian. So the Hungarian noblemen decided to kind of change the situation and invested into the language, and invested in developing a language that can be used to teach biology, physics, and all kinds of content area through that language, and they created academy through which, there a lot of linguists try to revitalize the language and try to create words for existing concepts. But these were not hundreds of words, but thousands of words, altogether 8,000 something like words, that they created. And what they try to do is to use them systematically in writing, systematically in books, and all kinds of things. And what happened was basically very positive, because the majority of these expressions remained. Why? Because the science, the education needed these expressions, but some of the other thousands were lost because they were not that important, So after all, there was this kind of process of selecting those labels that were needed, that were very useful for the educational purposes, and were very important for the societal purposes and so on. So after all, language is selective at the same time. This is a two-way street, It can be very selective. You can kind of create labels for existing concepts or whatever, and when they are needed, they will remain in the language, Need will create language, basically. So that's what it is. All right, Elaine, thank you very much for your presentation. And I want to kind of give the chance to Ngoc Tung to make his presentation about a paper that he read, and also you were supposed to have read. Okay, so Ngoc Tung, please take over the screen.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the article that I have a chance to read today, and the title of my presentation is Conceptualizing the Use of Translanguaging in Initial Content Assessment for Newly Arrived Emergent Bilingual Students. And this article was written by a group of 3 authors, and they are working for the ETS based in New Jersey. So today my presentation is comprised of 4 things, including the context of the study, the framework that the authors wanted to introduce to us, and the third one is about the application of different strategies in order to help us develop the teaching and assessment strategy for the newly bilingual students. And the last one is about some takeaway messages that we can remember for our practical use. So the authors found it very important for them to give us some impression of how to understand properly translanguaging, and they suggest that translanguaging is kind of how bilinguals flexibly use their entire linguistic repertoires as an integrated linguist system. And also they highlighted the needs of not only focusing on the language skills, but also the importance of social perspective that can help them see inherent value in own skills that the students may bring into their classroom, and that could support the teachers to implement the assessment strategy in a very effective way. So this is very similar to what we have discussed in the previous classes. So translanguaging is not about the accumulation of different linguistic repertoires, but they found that there is a unique system that can combine and allow the students to use different languages in a convenient fashion, and they can kind of like create something very unique in order to support their communicative purposes. So in terms of the context of the research, they found that it is very necessary for them and for us as well to understand the emerging and increasing trend of the students coming from bilingual backgrounds. So not only they can use the native speaker in the community, but also they want to learn and improve their English language in order to integrate in a globalized context. And that is the reason why we need to be aware of how we can use strategically in order to include all the students in the classroom of languages. Besides that, they tried to narrow down the context of their report, and they found that the multilingualism has increasingly received more attention from the scholarly attention, and they found the gap of literature that that shows how to apply the translanguaging in order to help them implement the assessment practices, and that is a very big gap that they were interested in continuing this important line of research. So from that perspective, they found two aspects of things that they need us to be remembered. The first thing is about the norm of language use, and they elaborated that the monolingualism is a kind of the perspective that they tend to separate the learners different languages and linguistic repertoire, but instead they view that the bilingual students' repertoire should be reviewed as like separate identities. So they expect that the late arriving bilingual students in any context should be able to operate in and effectively communicate in one unique language. So in another aspect of view, so that they found like a gap of literature was found, and they found that bilingual practices in the classroom were largely ignored, and they think that although the use of plain English is used in different language classroom, it still poses a lot of difficulties and struggle to the learners in order to integrate in the bilingual communities. So from those gaps of literature, they want to develop and they want to introduce different frameworks in support of showing how the teachers and educators can apply the assessment strategy in order to make their classroom more inclusive and more equitable. So they introduced two principles behind their the introduction of the framework. So one of which is about drawing on the students' entire linguistic repertoire, and in this regard, they suggest that the students should be able to use any language they wish in order to demonstrate the knowledge and skill in the content knowledge. And also, the students should be able to provide the opportunity for them to use a variety of translanguaging resources so that they can allow themselves to use these practices whenever needed, depending on the context, depending on the communicators, and depending on the communicative purposes. And the second principle behind their view is that it is very important for them to engage students in interaction through the translanguaging practices. So in terms of this, they provided a list of 3 items in order to be aware of. The first thing is that the importance should be placed on the student to teacher and the peer-to-peer interaction, and the purpose of which is that to create a safe environment for the students to enjoy and to participate in the interactive moment in support of the translanguaging. And the second thing is the role of the test administrator as a means of mediator. And this way is very useful for them to encourage students' motivation and their active in participation in the activity. And the last one is about the chance for the teachers and learners to be able to negotiate language differences in multiple languages instead of promoting the monolingualism in a classroom. So based on the 2 principles behind their view, they they map out a view that for us to understand the expected outcome of the two principles, in order to help us understand how the use of translanguaging can bring about benefits for the multilingual classrooms. So the key purpose of the theory of action that they introduced to us in the article is to show us a variety of strategy behind the translanguaging principle and how we can enact the effective bilingual assessment resources in order to allow the students and teachers to interact more conveniently and more openly behind the open space for them to make use of translanguaging for the initial assessment practice. So according to the framework on the slide, we can see that so each of the two principles can bring profound impact on the development of language, also in development of students in terms of linguistic competence and communicative competence. For example, for the principle number one, they say that it can allow the student to see the item and a part of the item in English in the home language. Also, they encourage students to write a response in English, the home language, or both of them. And the last one is to facilitate the student to say a response in English or the home language or both of them. Regarding the second principle, the effects are very numerous. First of all, they really want to invite students to see and listen to the synonym for certain words in English, and which can be written in home language English or both of them. Or another one is to encourage the student to listen to someone read out loud the direction or the item. So the entire item or specific part of the item. So regardless of any underlying principle, the author really want to see the improvement over the progress. So they kind of want to know how the assessment practices for the translanguaging can improve the opportunity for the newly arrived bilingual students to demonstrate what they know and can do in the content area, in addition to the language aspect. Specifically, they say the assessment should be able to give the bilingual students an opportunity to demonstrate their language and skill in a content language in a variety of ways. And another aspect of the benefit could be the fact that development of an assessment that meets bilingual students' needs are very important. And they continue to elaborate on the fact that we should give the student opportunity to use complex and fluid discursive practices, and they can allow them to use translanguaging wherever needed. Not just about like entirely over the progress or any certain amount of translanguaging practices within the classroom. So this is the description of how the theory of action underlying the two principles of translanguaging can help us understand more about how to enact the translanguaging assessment practices. So in order to continue their report, they proposes some applications that we can implement the translanguaging assessment practices. So one of them is the utilization of universal design, and they think that this principle is very accessible to the teachers and for the learners in varying levels and in different shape and form. And they think that the use of universal design is very helpful because it can allow the inclusive assessment population. They can give us a very clear and precise construct in order to be defined. And the items are very accessible, and they have very little to none bias in the items. They can accommodate linguistic differences and variety. And then they also introduce very simple, clear, intuitive instruction and procedure, and they can maximize the readability and comprehensibility for teachers to acknowledge and to implement in the classroom. And the last one, it's very important for us to maximize and the legibility of the test construct. So based on that, how they can implement practically in the classroom. So they think that the use of universal design can somehow address some problem that I studied above. That is the use of plain English may be able to pose some threat to their learners. So the use of universal design is a kind of like natural application, and that can serve different groups of English learners with varying levels of home language and English language proficiency. So that is a benefit which is very clear and transparent for the universal design. So based on that, they provide two forms of application. The first one is related to computer-based platform. They give us some analysis of what is good and bad about this kind of implementation. So in addition to some advantages of this kind of implementation, which are about unnecessarily scheduling proctors to capture the student response live, or they have elegant interface design, or they have context enriched and innovative tasks, or they have a virtual friend in order to help them diversify their communicative purposes. There are some drawbacks that we should be aware of. The first one is about the too many features available for the individualized language, individualized translanguaging support. So that kind of like bring the teachers and students into some difficulties, or they have a severe lack of an automatic scoring system that can score multiple kinds of constructed response system. This is an example of how the computer-based looks like, and you can see we have some features on this platform, including a language tab, right response, say response, say synonym, and listening to questions. And there are also additional features that can bring this form of delivery into attention. So we are able to see the translation or listen to specific part of the problem. So this is a visual diagram of how the computer look like. Another one is the use of teacher-mediated initial classroom assessment. So how it looks like. So in terms of the design of this mode of delivery, the test taker tend to self-navigate through the test booklet, and they record responses in the booklet or on a separate sheet of paper. There's primarily a interaction between the test taker and test administrator. And in this sense, the administrator of the test should be able to encourage and allow their students to maximize the language repertoire and different modes of languages as resource to demonstrate the answer to the question. So similarly, this form of delivery is manifold, including the advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages of this form of delivery is that it can individualize the support for the translanguaging support and practices. However, it may be very time consuming for teachers. It contains a large amount of material needed to produce the resources. It may have some difficulties for teachers and students to identify and recognize the dialect variation. It may push the teachers into some struggle of using the bilingualism in the assessment culture. So based on the different modes of delivery, so they give us some very short description of how application can allow us and bring different benefits. So the first one is the benefit of the use of universal for the assessment strategy of the translanguaging. So it can bring a lot of benefit for the late arriving bilingual students in order to fully demonstrate their knowledge and skill in the content area. And it also allows the teachers to better diagnose and understand the emerging bilingual students, and they can use that understanding in order to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the students from which they can continue to work on how to support them in a certain way. However, there are some challenges that still remain. First one, the educator in school must change their traditional monoclassic perspective of bilingual education. Also, the teacher must be bilingual rather than monolingual, and they need to be able to integrate the content knowledge and the language knowledge. They have to view that the translanguaging resources should be able to be standardized. And the last one is about literacy skill in each language, which can mediate access to an interaction with the text content. So these are some challenges that they proposed. So based on the article, I found that some questions that remain for us to continue our discussion. So the first question is, do you think that are emerging bilinguals able to effectively determine when they need to use English or their home languages? And the second one is about the equivalence across test forms that you consider different modes of delivery, and you think that they can provide equal validity and fairness of the use of translanguaging in initial mathematics and science assessment. And the last one, how to score the responses by using translanguaging in an effective way. And that is the content of my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Tung. Thank you very much. Yeah, actually the questions are quite good. So, okay, let's try to kind of discuss this whole thing about assessment, because that's a major issue as far as translanguaging is concerned, when you are actually allowed to also or be assessed through not just one language, but several languages. That's a major issue. Okay, Isabel, you wanted to say something? Or no? Okay. All right, so let's.
Sorry,
I'm
I had that muted. There was one thing that after what you were discussing earlier about the terminology and some languages not accepting that terminology, and some languages not having the terminology for some of the content areas, then I thought, because one of the challenges for assessment is to adopt or adapt tests and have all the resources in both languages. And theoretically, it should be available to all the languages, the diverse L1s in every single class where translanguaging is supposed to happen. And then it dawned on me that maybe some of these languages don't have the terminology to actually explain the concept, or it's a terminology that still has not been developed, or so that also poses a problem, because even if you spend so much money and time on creating those resources, there might still be languages that don't have full access to equivalent resources, because some of these terminology or expressions are not available to them either.
Yeah, that's a legitimate challenge, question, absolutely. Anything else?
Yeah, I know one of the things that we do with our newcomers, we use star reading and math for benchmarking in math at our school. I don't know if anyone else does it. You know, it's a standardized reading and math benchmarking program for K through 6. I think we use it K through 6.
But that's
K through 12. But so the thing is we have that Spanish option. There is that English-Spanish option, and we can do all of the same assessments that we do in English with fidelity in Spanish. But then it goes back to Isabel's point. There's really not, I mean, we're pushing for equity, but then how do we show that representation for all of the diverse languages? And that's, you know, that's a whole nother can of worms.
Absolutely, yeah, because, you know, theoretically it's a beautiful idea, but you just cannot do it. You know, I mentioned to you the Swedish example, you know, where actually they did that for some years, you know, that they said that, okay, if immigrants are in the school, if there are at least 6 immigrants in the school, they are entitled to be educated in their own language. And they started to create textbooks, all kinds of things, you know, and spend millions, and they went almost bankrupt, you know. So they decided to get rid of the whole thing, you know, because it's impossible. You just cannot do it, period. You know, we have the problem of bilingual education in this country, in America, you know, because bilingual education is beautiful in Canada because there are 23 million people there, you know, and 2 valorized languages. And, you know, bilingual programs and everything. And then, you know, they decided to take that over to the American education. It's a disaster. You cannot do that. Excuse me. I mean, you know, this is 360 million people that we are talking about. The other thing is that the resources are not the same as in Canada. Canada is a rich country. This country is rich at particular places, you know, or for particular things, you know, but it is not education, definitely.
We don't have the social infrastructure in the we don't invest enough into our social infrastructure in the United States to make that even the vaguest future possibility. Canada does. They spend that money. I think there are other countries that could, because they're working within the constraints make that possible. But doing it here, it's impossible. It's heartbreaking because it's such an awesome thing.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, the other thing is that here we have immigrants from more than 100 countries, or with more than 100 first languages. It's not the country, but the languages. That's what that counts, you know. And those like are as diverse as their speakers, you know. So it's important. So it's of course we can talk about equity, but we just cannot do anything about that. We should be very happy if we can do something about Spanish, where, you know.
Can't we do something like that here though? Like just make that decision and say, well, we're going to choose 2 languages. These are the 2 languages of the United States, English and Spanish. Let's roll with it. Canada did it. Why can't we do it? But then you look back and you think, well, how did the rollout of the metric system go in the United States?
Yeah.
Terribly.
You know, the metric system is not working here, so that would be a disaster if they introduced that. So they don't do that. It was. I remember it was a disaster even in the UK, which is a smaller country, you know. But when they introduced the metric system there, you know, the British wanted to leave the British Isles, you know, because they just didn't know what was happening, you know. So in America, they cannot do that. So, you know, it's not on the agenda, you know, so to do that, because everybody knows that it's really terrible, you know, even think about it. Okay, but let's go back to assessment, you know, because all right, you want to create some kind of really fair assessment for the students, you know, and right now we are not there. We are not there, and the question is whether translanguaging will change that or not. there was a proposal in the article that was actually presented by Tung. And what do you say about that? Beverly, you are not very talkative, I'm afraid, today. So, you know, I haven't heard your voice yet, so I would love to. So, do you still have some, you know, some?
My brain's going real slow today, Professor. Can you ask me the question again?
Yeah, I want to know what is your opinion about assessment through translanguaging, you know, so can we do assessment in different languages?
So I think assessment through translanguaging could be good in some situations. So here's my thoughts on this, and maybe someone else will have more to add or disagree or agree. So I could see how, especially for a student who, like looking at my own situation, for a student who is maybe at an intermediate or advanced proficiency, but there's some things that they are not sure how to express fully in English yet, allowing a student to use translanguaging in some forms of assessment could help them to really be able to fully express themselves, get their point across, and be understood by either the teacher or the peers. And so I think in that way, that could be very beneficial. Simultaneously, I think maybe it couldn't be used in every situation. So for example, in a foreign language class, you know, if the assessment is on the foreign language itself, then obviously you wouldn't want to use translanguaging in that situation, if that makes sense. But I do think, I don't know, I think that allowing a student to use translanguaging and use their full repertoire may help them to explain some things that could have been difficult for them to explain in solely one language. And I do think that could have a benefit.
Yeah, you know, the real problem is that what you said about foreign language, of course, there is no doubt about it, that if you are in a foreign language classroom and you study a foreign language like German, French, Chinese, or whatever it is, you have to be assessed in that language, you know, so you cannot bring in your first language or whatever, because that would be ridiculous. As far as content area is concerned, the real problem there, you know, is, of course, we already discussed whether the languages have the same notion, you know, whether we have labels, you know, that we can use to denote this and that. But in content areas also, there are some basic things. There is some core knowledge, you know, that has to be acquired if you want to know something about chemistry, biology, psychology, or whatever the subject is, you know. So when you are assessed, you have to focus on those basic things, and those basic things should be on the target, in the target language, you know. Of course, there should be an opportunity there to do some kind of explanation when you are not very good as remembering the right label for something. You can say that I don't know the right label, but here is a description of what I think or whatever, you know. So of course you can allow that. And that could be one of the possibilities, you know, where the student actually doesn't know exactly what it is. Even in my exams, you know, when I give exams to students, it happens that the student doesn't remember the terminology or whatever, but she gives a kind of description. And if the description is okay, they have in the terminology, you know. So that's the real issue as far as the assessment is concerned. But there is one thing for sure. It's almost impossible to give an open assessment in every single language that is represented in the student population. You cannot do that.
I absolutely agree, Professor. And I think that it's so important that we really talk about how this could be the most successful and beneficial for students in translanguaging. And I think we're looking at it through the wrong frame. We're looking at it as like a gauge for language, but what if we looked at it as a gauge for development. So one of the big problems that we have in ELL is cutting through all the red tape when we have students who have who are neuroatypical, right? So, when you meet a child who is on the autism spectrum, you know that that child is autistic. However, we still have to jump through a million hoops. And then we have to go, well, oh my goodness, we don't know anybody in the country who knows if there's even an assessment to am I still there? To test this kid to see if they're autistic. So then we have this huge problem. Well, this is where translanguaging can actually provide a really wonderful application. We can get that information about these kids so that then they can be put into special education that much faster and receive the supports that they wouldn't have gotten without it. For example, having a one-to-one paraprofessional to help them through their day.
Absolutely.
Can I also add something? I just was thinking about something that I'm going to maybe hopefully cover or not next Monday. But I also thought with having neurodiverse kids or having kids that cannot write, for example, right? Some of them
like kids.
A kid that whose writing was very unintelligible. It was mostly phonetic. So he was trying to write what it sounded like to him. And then in my tutoring, I accepted pictorial and representational drawings and all sorts of ways of showing what they understood as a substitute for a written response. And I wonder to what extent these assessments are going to allow that as a substitute for a written response or an oral response. And then also something that I found is that sometimes I even had to prompt them to explain even more in an interview, because that was not within the confines of the exercise that I proposed or that assessment that I proposed. It wasn't fully clear to me what they understood. So those are some of the, there are iffy, boundaries there, and there's things that still need to be investigated to see whether this could be, to what extent it could be done, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, Professor, I think since translanguaging helps us to be in our elements, to express our understanding, with our repertoire of whatever repertoire we have, I think, for instance, just like Isabel said, in my class, for instance, to measure their depth of knowledge, I accept drawings, demonstration of any kind to convince me that at least you got this or you didn't get that. So that falls within the ambience of the overall definition of translanguaging. So I will also support the opinion that we can use any measurable means at our disposal. But then whether it is a standardized way is a different kettle of fish altogether. Yeah.
Okay, good point. All right, guys, I think that time has expired. So thank you for your